They whispered that death had already won, that hunger was the only destiny. The icy air at 70 degrees cut through their lungs, and the blizzard's howl was the village's funeral song. Yelena, the elderly widow with skin marked by countless winters, felt the weight of every desperate gaze, the echo of empty bellies. With a determination that defied her age, she gripped her ancestral oak spear, her eyes fixed on the white expanse where, legend said, a herd of 7 giant buffalo, each weighing 5,000 kilos, roamed. No one believed that a woman alone could face the fury of nature and the brute strength of such beasts. And what she was about to do would forever change the boundary between legend and reality. Yelena's eyes, though clouded by age, burned with a flame that no winter had managed to extinguish. She didn't hear the whispers of disbelief from the younger ones, nor the resigned laments of the elders huddled in their furs. Her gaze was fixed on the sled, carefully prepared in the snow, and on her 6 loyal dogs, the Kolima, whose intelligent eyes seemed to reflect the same urgency that pulsed in her own heart. They were animals with dense fur and strong muscles, accustomed to desolation, but even they felt the tension in the air. With firm steps, despite her aged body, Yelena approached. Every movement was a challenge, a battle against the stiffness of her joints and the weakness that hunger also imposed upon her. But with each step, the image of the village children's pale faces etched deeper into her mind, propelling her forward. She remembered how her grandchildren, whose parents had succumbed to less cruel winters, looked at her with a silent hope, an innocent faith she could not betray. The oak spear, heavy in her hand, seemed an extension of her own will. Mikhail, one of the few men still with some strength, approached hesitantly. His hunched shoulders and downcast gaze betrayed shame and helplessness. "Yelena, there's no need. It's madness. No one can return from there." His voice was a hoarse murmur, almost inaudible against the wind that was now beginning to intensify, whipping snowflakes like needles. Yelena turned to him, her wrinkled face a mask of determination. "It's not madness, Mikhail. It's our last hope, and hope doesn't die as long as there's a heart to carry it." She placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that conveyed surprising strength. "Take care of our people. I will return." She didn't wait for a reply. With a nod to the dogs, who were already stirring, eager, Yelena climbed onto the sled. The reindeer furs, which once served as comfortable shelter, were now just precarious insulation against the biting cold. She adjusted the bindings, checked the load, a few provisions, an axe, ropes, and her hunting tools, all essential for the 300-kilometer journey. The moment of departure was enveloped in a heavy silence. No one dared to speak. The women, their faces covered by scarves, watched from afar, some with frozen tears on their eyelids, others with silent admiration. The men, heads bowed, felt the weight of their own inaction. Only the children, with their large, curious eyes, seemed to understand the grandeur of what was happening. They waved timidly, as if bidding farewell to a legendary figure already departing for the annals of history. With a soft command, the Kolima set off, their paws sinking into the soft snow and raising clouds of icy powder. The sled glided, leaving behind the dark huts of the village, which quickly became small dots in the desolate white immensity. The wind howled, now a chorus of invisible voices that seemed to test Yelena's resolve. The cold was a constant presence, an invisible enemy trying to penetrate every layer of skin, every muscle fiber. But Yelena, wrapped in her furs and her unwavering faith, felt she was not alone. The wisdom of her ancestors, the strength of the women who preceded her, and the love for her people all accompanied her, an invisible shield against the fury of Yakutia. The journey had barely begun, and the vast icy expanse already presented itself as a colossal challenge. But her spirit, stronger than steel, was ready, for battle. The white vastness swallowed the sled and its occupants. Every gust of wind seemed to tear a piece from her soul, but Yelena pressed her lips together, refusing to yield. The sun, pale and distant, offered little light and no warmth. The fine, cutting snow whipped her face, and she felt her eyelids heavy, almost frozen, requiring constant effort to keep them open. Her fingers, even in her reindeer skin gloves, tingled with the icy pain of the cold. The Kolyma, with powerful paws, forged a path through the deep snow. Their muscular bodies and dense fur were a natural barrier against the cold, but Yelena saw the thick mist from their nostrils, a sign of their Herculean effort. She murmured words of encouragement, whispers of gratitude. "Good, my children. Keep going. For us. For everyone." They responded with renewed pulling, eyes fixed on the invisible horizon. The connection between them was deeper than mere commands, a silent dance of trust and mutual need. The hours stretched into an icy eternity. The landscape didn't change, only the intensity of the wind and the depth of the snow. Yelena felt the stiffness in her back and legs, a constant reminder of her age. Every jolt of the sled was a pang, but she refused to focus on the pain. Her mind traveled to the village, to the thin faces and hungry eyes. She remembered little Anya, her granddaughter, who had drawn a buffalo in the snow with a branch, hoping her grandmother would find it. This image was a balm for her tired soul, a flame that kept her from faltering. The greatest obstacle for now was not creature or trap, but Yakutia itself. The cold was a silent predator. Exhaustion, a slow poison. Yelena knew that persistence was her only weapon. She used the wisdom of generations, reading the signs of the wind, the texture of the snow, the direction of the shadows to stay on course. There were no trails, only the immensity. With each brief pause to adjust the bindings or offer dried meat to the dogs, she felt her body protest, but her spirit refused to bend. As evening fell, the sky took on shades of purple and grey, and the wind intensified, bringing a new threat, an incipient blizzard. The snowflakes, once fine, became dense and swirled, reducing visibility to almost zero. Yelena knew that continuing would be an even greater risk. She needed to find shelter. Her eyes, accustomed to deciphering the landscape, searched for any rock formation or depression in the terrain that could offer minimal protection. Experience told her that underestimating the blizzard's fury was a fatal mistake. The dogs, sensing the change in weather, barked softly, an anxious sound that echoed in the desolation. Yelena stroked the head of the lead dog, Koda, a Siberian husky with piercing blue eyes. "We're almost there, my friend. Just a little further." She pointed to a distant rocky outcrop, almost swallowed by the falling snow. It was a precarious refuge, the only one in sight. Hope, fragile as thin ice, was the force that propelled her. With each pull of the sled, with each step of the dogs, Yelena felt she was not just traveling 300 kilometers, but across a bridge between life and death, carrying the fate of her village on her shoulders. The challenge was immense, but her will unbreakable. The rocky outcrop, which seemed a promise of refuge, proved to be a challenge in itself. The snow accumulated on its slopes made the ascent steep and slippery. Yelena, with an effort that cost her every fiber of her being, got off the sled and began to guide the dogs on foot, clearing a path with her spear. The wind, now a furious whirlwind, lifted the snow in blinding veils, and the sound of its howl was so loud it seemed to vibrate in her bones. The Kolyma, even exhausted, responded to her command, their paws finding traction where there seemed to be none. They moved as an extension of her, a team united against the fury of nature. Finally, they reached a small indentation in the rock, barely enough to shelter the sled and the dogs, and for Yelena to huddle. It wasn't a cave, just a recess that offered a partial barrier against the cutting wind. Quickly, With her already numb hands, she untied the extra furs from the sled, using them to create an improvised shelter at the opening, trying to seal off as much of the cold as possible. The work was slow and painful, each knot a torment for her stiff fingers. She distributed small portions of dried meat to the dogs, who devoured them in seconds, their eyes gleaming in the incipient darkness. Huddled between Koda and another dog, Yelena tried to find some warmth. The cold was relentless, penetrating layers of skin and fabric, seeking the vital warmth of her body. She could feel the dogs trembling, not from fear, but from exhaustion and cold. She stroked their dense fur, feeling the strong pulse beneath her hands. "We are together, my brave ones," she whispered, her voice hoarse. The connection with them was a tenuous thread of human and animal warmth in the icy vastness. The blizzard outside transformed into a roaring monster. The wind seemed to want to tear the rock itself, and the snow whipped the fur barrier with the force of 1,000 lashes. Yelena closed her eyes, but the sound and the cold were inescapable. She thought of the village, of how they would be sheltering, of how little Anya would be curled in her fur bed, dreaming of food. A pang of guilt struck her. Why had she, an elder, been the only one to rise? But guilt quickly gave way to determination. There was no time for questions, only for action. She remembered her grandmother's stories, told by the flickering light of the campfire, about winters that lasted years, and how willpower was more potent than any blizzard. Her grandmother had lost a child to the cold, but never bowed. Yelena felt the presence of all the women of her lineage, an invisible current of resilience that enveloped her. They had faced bears, wolves, frozen rivers, and eternal winters. She would not be the first to fail. The night advanced, and time seemed to stretch infinitely. Yelena didn't sleep, only rested, attentive to every change in the wind, every movement of the dogs. Her muscles ached, her throat was dry, but the flame in her chest burned, fueled by the image of her villagers' faces. She knew that morning would bring more cold, more snow, and the need to continue. But she also knew that each day overcome was a step closer to the buffalo, a step closer to salvation. With a deep sigh, she nestled closer to Koda, feeling the faint warmth emanating from him, a silent promise that together they would face whatever came. The night was long, but Yelena's spirit was stronger than the darkness and the ice, an unbreakable force. The first light of dawn, pale and cold, barely pierced the icy mist. The blizzard had ceased, leaving an oppressive silence broken only by the distant rustle of the wind. Yelena opened her eyes, feeling every muscle protest. Stiff and sore, the cold had penetrated her bones. As she moved her fingers, a bearable tingling succeeded the pain. Beside her, the collimer stirred. Koda lifted his head, blue eyes fixed on Yelena, full of intelligence and loyalty. She stroked the dog's muzzle. "Good morning, my brave one," she whispered, her voice hoarse. The other dogs awoke, stretching, eager to start again, despite their tiredness. Leaving the shelter was a challenge. Fresh snow covered everything deeper, and the wind, less furious, was cutting. Yelena felt her body tremble, but the image of Anya and the hungry faces of the village was a fire burning within her, stronger than the cold. She untied the fur bindings, storing them on the sled. Every movement was deliberate, a slow dance against the rigidity of the ice. The landscape had changed. The hills were gentle undulations under an immaculate white mantle. The air was so clear that she seemed to see for hundreds of kilometers, but the vastness, without reference points, was disorienting. Yelena knew that with each step, the danger of getting lost increased. She needed to trust her intuition, the stars and the air currents. As the dogs pulled the sled through the virgin snow, the elder noticed something worrying. The terrain ahead had a subtle, almost imperceptible sheen, betraying a layer of ice beneath the snow. It wasn't cracked ice, but a smooth, treacherous surface formed by freezing and thawing, covered by fine, soft snow. The dogs began to slip. Koda stopped, looking at Yelena with uncertainty. Yelena got off the sled, her experienced eyes assessing the situation. "Black ice," she murmured, remembering her father's teachings. "Silent and treacherous. Walking on it was like walking on glass, and the sled with its weight could easily lose control. Ancestral wisdom whispered in her mind, "Don't fight the ice, but use it." She took the axe from the sled. With slow, precise movements, she began to cut small grooves into the ice surface, just beneath the snow, creating an uneven path for the dog's paws and the sled's runners. The effort was immense, each blow reverberating in her aching shoulders. But she persisted, meter after meter, clearing a safe path. The dogs watched, patient, trusting their leader. When the grooved path was ready, Yelena returned to the sled. "Now, my friends," she said with a tired smile, slowly and carefully. The Kolyma, feeling the new texture beneath their paws, advanced with more certainty. The elder felt a small victory, a reminder that strength was not just muscular, but also intelligence and patience, propelling her forward. The village waited, and she would not fail. The grooved path, exhausting to create, proved to be the right choice. The Kolyma, more confident, found grip on the ice, and the sled glided with stability, avoiding a disastrous slip. Yelena, on the sled, watched the dogs pause, their synchronized movements, a dance of survival. The high sun cast a dazzling glare over the immensity, transforming the ice into a shimmering mirror. She squeezed her eyelids, pain throbbing in her temples, but refused to look away. She needed to be attentive to every detail, every change. Hours passed, and the black ice landscape gave way to deep snow. The relief was palpable, but exhaustion deepened. Yelena felt her body heavy, her mind fighting against the desire to succumb to sleep. The image of her village's thin faces, especially Anya's, was an invisible whip that propelled her. The promise of not returning empty-handed was her fuel, more potent than any food. Koda, the leader, stopped, sniffing the air. His blue eyes widened, and a low growl escaped. The other dogs stirred, their gazes fixed in one direction. Yelena felt a shiver, an ancestral premonition that rarely failed. She got off the sled, spear in hand, and approached Koda, scrutinizing the vast whiteness. Nothing visible, only snow and horizon. However, the tension in the dogs was undeniable. "What is it, my friend?" she whispered, stroking Koda. The dog sniffed the air and pointed to a distant rock formation, almost indistinguishable in the mist. Yelena followed his gaze. They were pillars of ice and rock, sculpted by the wind, rising like sentinels. She knew those formations, the howling stones, a natural labyrinth where the wind created ghostly sounds. And many hunters had gotten lost. It was not a predator, but a natural trap, as her intuition had warned. The people's wisdom said that the howling stones were a test of spirit, where the mind could play tricks, and disorientation was the greatest enemy. Entering the labyrinth meant losing one's way, spending days and provisions, or worse, getting caught in a blizzard. But the buffalo's path, according to legends, passed through there. Yelena took a deep breath, the icy air burning her lungs. She looked at the dogs, who watched her, waiting. There was latent fear in their eyes, but also unwavering trust. She could not retreat. The village depended on her. With a firm nod, she indicated the direction of the howling stones. "Let's go, my brave ones. Together we will find the way." The dogs hesitated, but with a unified pull they followed. Yelena climbed onto the sled, her heart pounding. With each meter closer to the rock formations, the wind's howl intensified, transforming into laments and whispers, voices of ancient spirits. The elder gripped her spear, a link to her ancestors, a promise that the wisdom of generations would guide her. The 300-kilometer journey was more than physical distance. It was a crossing through legends and dangers. Yelena was ready to face each one, with the strength of her indomitable spirit and the hope of the village on her shoulders. The labyrinth of ice and rock of the howling stones swallowed them. The wind, once a distant howl, now echoed and multiplied among the sculpted pillars, creating a ghostly symphony of laments and whispers. It seemed as if the voices of ancestors mingled with the air currents, sometimes calling her name, sometimes mocking her audacity. Yelena squeezed her eyes shut, trying to focus, but the landscape was a nightmare of repetitive shapes and dancing shadows. Each ice pillar seemed identical to the last, and the snow, whimsically swept and deposited, erased any trace that could serve as a guide. The Colima, once so confident, also felt the strangeness of the place. Their steps became hesitant, and their low barks, usually full of purpose, now sounded like whimpers of uncertainty. Koda, the leader, stopped several times, sniffing the air with anxiety, his blue eyes wide, searching for something Yelena couldn't see. She got off the sled, feeling the weight of the dog's fear, which added to her own. The spear felt heavier, and the cold, more biting, as if the labyrinth itself tried to penetrate her soul. "Come on, my children," she said, her voice a thread of hope in the immensity. "We cannot stop." But every direction seemed wrong. She tried to remember her father's teachings about the howling stones, about how the wind could deceive the ears and eyes, but memories seemed to slip from her mind, obscured by tiredness and confusion. She felt a pang of panic, a knot in her throat. Would her ancestral wisdom fail for the first time? The sun began to dip, and shadows lengthened, further distorting the landscape. Yelena felt her head spin. She was sure she had passed that same ice pillar before, perhaps 2, 3 times. An oppressive sense of déjà vu washed over her. She stopped, closing her eyes tightly, trying to clear her mind. When she opened them, the sight of a colossal buffalo, standing a few meters away, made her heart leap. It was one of the mythical buffalo, with fur white as snow and horns that looked like ancient trees. She gripped her spear. A cry of triumph caught in her throat. The dogs, however, didn't react. Koda merely looked in the opposite direction, as if nothing was there. Yelena blinked, and the image of the buffalo dissolved into the air, revealing only a mound of snow and ice, shaped by the wind. A mirage. The labyrinth was playing tricks on her mind. A wave of despair hit her. Her knees buckled, and she had to lean on the sled. The voices of the wind seemed to laugh at her, and the shadows danced, transforming into menacing figures. She was lost, not just in the labyrinth, but within herself. The unwavering faith that had propelled her for so many kilometers began to waver. She could not fail. She could not. But how to find the way when reality itself was distorted? Yelena looked at Koda, her eyes tearful. The dog, as if sensing her anguish, approached and nudged his muzzle into her hand, a silent gesture of comfort. It was then that she remembered an ancient YAKUT proverb: "When the eyes deceive, the heart and scent guide." She couldn't trust what she saw or heard, but she could trust her dogs, their animal intuition. She knelt in the snow, closing her eyes again. But this time not to clear her mind, but to silence it. She took a deep breath, the icy air filling her lungs. She focused on the smell of the snow, on the sound of the wind which, though deceptive, had subtle patterns, and on the energy of the dogs. She stood up, determination returning stronger than before. It wasn't about her, but about the village. She gripped Koda's leash. "Not by what we see, my friend, but by what we feel. Let's go." She decided to trust the dog's instincts, letting them guide her. The path was still uncertain, but hope, once almost extinguished, rekindled, a small flame renewed in the heart of the icy labyrinth. Yelena released Koda's leash, but kept her hand close to his dense fur, feeling the warmth and vibration of his energy. The lead dog, his blue eyes now more focused, began to move slowly, not in a straight line, but in a careful zigzag, sniffing the air and snow with an instinctive precision that surpassed any human map or memory. The other columner followed, their bodies tense, but confident in Koda's leadership and Yelena's faith. She observed every movement, every tilt of the dog's head, every tremor of his ears, as if she were reading a secret language written in nature itself. The wind continued to howl, but now, instead of letting herself be deceived by its ghostly voices, Yelena tried to discern the patterns, the currents that indicated openings or dead ends. It was an exercise of deep concentration, a silent dance between the elder and her animals, guided by a wisdom that came not from books, but from the earth itself. With each step, the mental fog that had enveloped her in the howling stones began to dissipate. She realized that the labyrinth was not just a physical challenge, but a test of her own ability to trust what she couldn't see, to silence her mind and listen to her heart. Her feet, once hesitant, now found a firmer rhythm in the snow. The pain in her muscles and joints was still there, a constant reminder of her age and the effort, but she embraced it as an ally, a sign that she was alive and fighting. Koda stopped abruptly, the fur on his neck bristling. A low growl, almost inaudible, escaped his throat. Yelena stopped immediately, her heart racing. She looked in the direction the dog indicated, but saw nothing but a wall of ice and snow. However, the air was different, denser, and a subtle, almost imperceptible scent reached her nostrils. It wasn't the smell of a predator, but something ancient, mineral, with a touch of dampness that didn't belong in that dry, frozen environment. Koda began to dig in the snow with his front paws, frantically. The other dogs joined him, and in a few moments they revealed a narrow crevice at the base of the ice wall, almost completely hidden by accumulated snow. It was a passage, dark and narrow, that seemed to lead into the bowels of the rock. Yelena felt a mixture of apprehension and hope. Her father had spoken of secret passages in the howling stones, shortcuts known only to animals, but which were risky, as they could collapse or lead to even more dangerous places. She knelt, feeling the cold, damp air coming from the crevice. The mineral smell was stronger there. It was a risk, yes, but continuing to drift in the labyrinth was a slow death sentence. The village needed her. She looked at Koda, who stared at her with his blue eyes as if asking for permission. Yelena smiled, a tired smile, but full of gratitude. "You are wise, my son. Let's go." She untied the sled from the dogs, knowing it wouldn't fit through the crevice. She would have to carry it in parts or leave it. The decision was quick. The lives of the dogs and her own were more important than the equipment. With a nod, she signaled the dogs to enter. They hesitated for a moment, but then, one by one, slipped through the narrow opening. Yelena took her spear and a small backpack with essential provisions. With a last look at the abandoned sled, she squeezed through the crevice, feeling the ice brush against her furs. The path was dark and narrow, but with each step, the certainty that she was on the right path, guided by a force greater than her own, grew in her heart. Hope solidified, transforming into a burning flame that illuminated the darkness ahead. She wasn't just following the dogs, she was following the echo of 1,000 generations, the ancestral melody of survival. The darkness in the crevice was almost absolute, a heavy cloak that swallowed the little light that dared to penetrate. Yelena advanced, bent over, the rough ice brushing her furs and the cold rock scraping her shoulders. Every movement was a test of endurance for her aged body, but her spirit refused to yield. The air was dense, laden with the damp smell of minerals and the warm breath of the dogs ahead, an olfactory symphony of life amidst the ice. Koda, with his agility and infallible instinct, moved cautiously, his steps muffled by the oppressive silence of the passage. The other Kolyma followed closely, their bodies squeezing through the gaps, their panting echoing in the narrow walls, a chorus of canine determination. Yelena felt claustrophobia tighten its grip, an ancient fear of being crushed by the earth, of the rocks closing in on her. Her already aching muscles protested with every movement, and the effort to maintain balance on the uneven ground, sometimes icy, sometimes rocky, was immense. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, not just from physical exertion, but from the adrenaline of uncertainty and the responsibility she carried. "We are together, my brave ones," she whispered, more to herself than to the dogs. Her hoarse voice reverberating strangely in the confined space. She reached out, feeling Koda's dense fur, seeking the comfort of connection, a vital link in the icy vastness. The dog responded with a gentle nudge of his muzzle against her palm, a silent reminder that she was not alone, that their loyalty was unwavering. Ancestral wisdom, which had compelled her to trust the animal's instincts, was now her only beacon, guiding her through the darkness. She closed her eyes for an instant, allowing her other senses to take control. The distant sound of dripping water, the smell of increasing dampness, the feel of the ice beneath her boots, all became part of an invisible map etched into her YAKUT soul. After what seemed like endless hours, the crevice began to widen slightly, offering a glimpse of relief. A pale, ghostly light appeared ahead, an invitation and a mystery, a thread of hope. The dogs quickened their pace, anticipation visible in their agile movements. Yelena, with a final effort that drained her last reserves of energy, slipped out of the passage, emerging into a vast and impressive cave. The ceiling, high and irregular, glittered with millions of ice crystals, and stalactites and stalagmites formed fantastic columns that rose from the floor and descended from above, like sculptures of a forgotten god. In the center, an underground lake of dark, still waters reflected the faint light coming from an opening in the ceiling, revealing a deep, bluish glow, almost magical. The air in the cave was milder, almost warm compared to the biting cold outside, and the silence was profound, broken only by the slow, rhythmic dripping of water. It was a hidden sanctuary, a world apart, untouched by Yakutia's merciless winter. The Kolyma, marveling, looked around, their blue eyes capturing the icy beauty with an almost childlike curiosity. Yelena, however, felt something more. Something that made her heart race, a strong, unmistakable scent, not of a predator, but of a large, wild animal, and very close. A smell of damp earth, moss, and something else, a musky odor she recognized from her father's stories about the guardians of the mountains. She approached the edge of the lake, her eyes scrutinizing the darkness with renewed intensity. And then she saw deep marks in the frozen mud on the lake's banks, footprints as large as a dinner plate, unmistakable. They were the footprints of the titanic buffalo. Not one, but many, indicating that the herd had passed through there, perhaps even sheltered in the cave for a considerable time. A wave of overwhelming emotion washed over her, relief, triumph, and a new surge of determination that filled her with unexpected vigor. She was on the right path. The village would be saved. Yelena touched one of the footprints with the tips of her stiff fingers, feeling the rough texture of the frozen mud, tangible proof that her journey was not in vain. The dogs, sensing the change in her mood, approached, Koda nudging his head against her leg, sharing the moment of discovery. The cave was not just a refuge, but a portal to hope, a place where legend became reality. The journey continued, but now with renewed purpose and the certainty that the reward was dangerously close. Yelena touched one of the footprints with the tips of her stiff fingers, feeling the rough texture of the frozen mud, tangible proof that her journey was not in vain. The dogs, sensing the change in her mood, approached, Coda nudging his head against her leg, sharing the moment of discovery. The cave was not just a refuge, but a portal to hope, a place where legend became reality. The journey continued, but now, with renewed purpose and the certainty that the reward was dangerously close. She knelt on the muddy bank, not just to examine the footprints, but to feel the earth, to connect with the energy emanating from that sacred place. Her eyes scanned the vast cave, searching for signs, listening to the silence that seemed to hold ancient secrets. The musky scent of the buffalo was undeniable, stronger now, indicating that they were not just passing through, but perhaps resting in some deeper part of that ice complex. Coda lifted his head, sniffing the air with renewed intensity, his blue eyes fixed on a dark opening on the opposite side of the underground lake. It was an almost imperceptible passage, hidden by a curtain of stalactites, a natural veil that guarded the mystery. The other dogs also sensed the presence, their bodies tense but without fear, only an ancestral curiosity. Yelena felt a shiver, not from cold, but from anticipation. Her father's wisdom, which spoke of buffalo as beings that moved like shadows, using the earth as their sanctuary, echoed in her mind. They were not just animals. They were spirits of the tundra, guardians of the ice. Confronting them would require more than strength. It would require respect and cunning. She rose slowly, the pain in her knees a constant reminder. But adrenaline pulsed through her veins, suppressing her fatigue. She knew she couldn't simply charge forward. A 500-kilo buffalo, even asleep, was a mountain of flesh and muscle, capable of crushing anyone who dared disturb it. She needed a plan, a strategy that would honor the creature's life and ensure her village's survival. Her eyes fixed on the dark passage. That's where they were. She needed to observe, understand their movements, their routines before acting. Patience was the Yakut hunter's greatest weapon, and Yelena possessed a patience forged by decades of harsh winters and endless waits. "Coda, my brave one," she whispered, stroking the dog's head. "Let's observe, carefully." The dogs, understanding the seriousness of the moment, moved in silence, their steps barely audible on the frozen mud. Yelena guided them behind a large ice formation, which offered cover and a strategic observation point. From there, she could see the entrance to the dark passage, a slit in the veil of stalactites. Time seemed to stop. She sat in the snow, protected by the ice, and took a piece of dried meat from her backpack, offering it to Coda. The dog accepted it delicately, his eyes never straying from the passage. Yelena ate a small piece too, feeling the energy spread through her body. The village's hunger was a heavy burden, but the proximity of success was a balm. She thought of Anya, of her childish laughter, of her bright eyes full of hope. She thought of the elders, of their faces marked by deprivation, of the faith they placed in her. The responsibility was immense, but it didn't crush her. On the contrary, it strengthened her. Hours dragged on, marked only by the dripping of water and the rhythmic breathing of the dogs. The light coming from the opening in the cave ceiling began to dim, plunging the ice sanctuary into a bluish twilight. Yelena felt the cold penetrate her furs, but she didn't move. Her eyes, accustomed to the darkness, were fixed on the passage. Suddenly, a colossal shadow moved in the darkness of the opening. A deep, guttural sound, a profound snort, echoed through the cave, making the ice crystals vibrate. It was one of the buffalo, emerging slowly, its imposing silhouette filling the passage. Its horns, like branches of ancient trees, brushed against the cave ceiling. Yelena held her breath, her heart beating like a drum. The sight was majestic and terrifying. The buffalo was even larger than legends described, a giant with fur white as snow, with dark, deep eyes that seemed to carry the wisdom of ages. It moved with deliberate slowness, its colossal weight making the ground tremble slightly. It approached the lake. lowered its head, and began to drink the dark water, a soft, rhythmic sound that filled the silence. Yelena observed every detail, every movement, engraving them in her mind. She needed to understand the beast, to become part of its world for an instant, before attempting the impossible. The final hunt was about to begin, not with the strength of the spear, but with the intelligence of spirit and wisdom. The buffalo continued to drink, its thick lips brushing the water's surface, creating small ripples that spread across the dark lake. Yelena observed the creature with silent reverence, noting how its muscles contracted beneath the thick white hide, the way its massive horns tilted slightly with each gulp. There was no haste in its movements, only the imposing calm of a being that dominated its environment. She noticed a pattern. The buffalo drank for long minutes, then raised its head, sniffed the air, and looked around with its deep eyes, as if attentive to any change in the ice sanctuary. Then it would drink again, repeating the cycle. The colima lying beside Yelena also watched, their muzzles resting on their paws, but their blue eyes were fixed on the beast with an almost human concentration. Koda, in particular, seemed to absorb every detail, his breathing soft and steady. Yelena felt the connection with her dogs, an invisible network of understanding and purpose that united them in that crucial moment. She thought of her grandmother's teachings, who said that the great animals of the tundra were mirrors of nature itself, and that to understand them, one must first understand oneself. She closed her eyes for an instant, visualizing the cave's map in her mind. The lake, the dark passage from which the buffalo emerged, the ice formations, the high ceiling. The air was warmer near the lake, perhaps indicating an underground air current or the animal's own presence. This was crucial. The buffalo, despite their resistance to cold, sought the relative comfort of the cave. They were creatures of habit, and Yelena's patience would be her greatest ally. She opened her eyes, a glint of determination in them. The spear, once a symbol of confrontation, now seemed more an extension of her will, a tool to guide, not to harm. The village, with its hungry and hopeful faces, was the driving force behind every beat of her heart. Anya, little Anya, whose innocence depended on her success, was the image that kept her from hesitating. The buffalo, satisfied, raised its head one last time, let out a deep snort that echoed through the cave, and with slow, heavy steps began to return to the dark passage. Yelena observed how it moved, how its weight was distributed, how it avoided certain areas of the muddy, frozen ground. There was a small, natural ramp near the entrance to the passage, covered by a thin, almost imperceptible layer of slippery ice. The buffalo carefully skirted it, preferring to step on the firmer rock beside it. A thought formed in Yelena's mind, an idea that seemed crazy, but aligned with the wisdom of YAKUT hunters who didn't use brute force against giants. She needed to create a situation where the buffalo's own weight, combined with the treacherous nature of the ice, could be the key to its fall. Not a violent trap, but a subtle manipulation of the environment. She looked at Koda, who stared at her as if reading her thoughts. "We need ice, my friend," she whispered, "and a little water, and patience." Koda wagged his tail slightly, a sign of understanding. Yelena knew she had to act with extreme caution. The herd was close, and any false move could alert them, making the hunt impossible. The buffalo disappeared into the darkness of the passage, and silence returned to reign in the cave, broken only by the dripping of water. Yelena waited, allowing the adrenaline to subside, her mind to calm. She needed clarity to execute her plan. With a look at the dogs, she indicated that they should remain hidden. She stood up, her muscles protesting, but her mind was sharp. The first part of her plan involved the slippery ramp. She needed to make it even more treacherous, perhaps with a thin layer of water that would freeze quickly. creating a surface impossible for such a heavy animal to cross without losing balance. But how to get water and ice there without being detected? The cave offered resources, but the risk was immense. She moved silently towards the lake, her steps light on the frozen mud. With her small leather scoop, she began to collect the icy water, feeling the cold penetrate her gloves. Every drop was precious, every movement calculated. The village waited. The village's hope was her guide, the force that propelled her to defy the impossible, to orchestrate the final dance between life and death, not with violence, but with the cunning and wisdom that only Yakut Winters could forge. She was ready. The village's hope was her guide, the force that propelled her to defy the impossible, to orchestrate the final dance between life and death, not with violence, but with the cunning and wisdom that only Yakut Winters could forge. She was ready. With the scoop full of icy water, Yelena moved with the calculated slowness of a shadow. Every step on the frozen mud was deliberate, every breath held so as not to break the deep silence of the cave. Her eyes, accustomed to the gloom, scrutinized the slippery ramp near the entrance to the passage, the exact spot where the buffalo had avoided stepping. The thin layer of natural ice was already treacherous, but she needed to make it an invisible and relentless trap. With extreme care, she began to pour the water from the scoop onto the ramp in a thin, continuous line. The dark liquid spread over the ice, finding the tiny imperfections of the surface and merging with them. The intense cold of the cave acted quickly, and in a few minutes the water transformed into a glassy film, almost undetectable to the naked eye, covering the ramp like a treacherous veil. She repeated the process several times, filling the scoop at the lake and returning to the ramp, until the surface was perfectly smooth and slippery, an ice trap ready to receive its giant. With each trip, the pain in her knees and back increased, but the image of the village's hungry faces, especially Anya's, gave her strength to continue. When she finished, Yelena retreated behind the ice formation where the dogs awaited her. Koda stared at her with an intensity that seemed to understand the gravity of what she had done. The other Kolima were tense, but silent, their bodies still, their blue eyes fixed on the dark passage. The wait began again, more agonizing than before. Every minute seemed like an hour, every drip of water in the lake, a drum beating in her chest. Yelena felt the cold penetrate her bones, but she didn't move. She closed her eyes, focusing on the sounds, the smells, the energy of the cave. She needed to feel the buffalo before seeing it. Hours dragged on, and the pale light from the cave ceiling almost extinguished, plunging the sanctuary into near total darkness. Suddenly, a deep, dragging sound echoed from the dark passage. It wasn't a snort, but a heavy movement, the dragging of a colossal body. The dogs stiffened, their growls low and muffled. Yelena opened her eyes, her heart pounding. The imposing silhouette of the buffalo began to emerge from the darkness, its massive horns brushing the ceiling. The giant moved with the same deliberate slowness as before, its deep, wise eyes sweeping the cave. It approached the lake, and Yelena held her breath. The buffalo followed its usual path, but this time, instead of skirting the ramp, its steps led it directly onto the treacherous surface. The instant its first hoof touched the newly formed ice, the buffalo hesitated, its muscles contracted, and it tried to regain its balance, but the colossal weight of its 5,000 kilos and the slippery surface conspired against it. With a deep sound and a tremor that made the entire cave vibrate, the buffalo slipped. Its hind legs lost traction, and its massive body toppled sideways, falling with a dull thud that echoed like thunder. It tried to get up, struggling, but the ice offered no support. Its head gently hit an ice formation, and it let out a deep groan, not of pain, but of frustration and confusion. The giant was on the ground, immobilized by Yelena's cunning and the betrayal of the ice. Yelena felt an overwhelming wave of relief and gratitude. Tears welled in her eyes, streaming down the wrinkles of her aged face. She had succeeded. The buffalo was down. The village would be saved. Koda, sensing the change in her mood, nudged his head against her hand, a silent reminder of their shared victory. The final hunt had reached its climax, and Yelena's ancestral wisdom had prevailed, securing the promise of life in the icy heart of Yakutia. Yelena felt an overwhelming wave of relief and gratitude. Tears welled in her eyes, streaming down the wrinkles of her aged face. She had succeeded. The buffalo was down. The village would be saved. Koda, sensing the change in her mood, nudged his head against her hand, a silent reminder of their shared victory. The final hunt had reached its climax, and Yelena's ancestral wisdom had prevailed, securing the promise of life in the icy heart of Yakutia. She approached the giant with hesitant steps, her heart heavy. The creature, though immobilized, still breathed with difficulty, its deep eyes blinking slowly, without anger, just a silent acceptance. Yelena knelt beside its colossal head, touching the thick white fur with the tips of her stiff fingers. "Forgive us, spirit of the tundra," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "It is a necessary sacrifice for life to continue. Your gift will feed many, and your strength will live within us." It was an ancient ritual, a silent prayer that Yakut hunters uttered before any harvest from nature. She took a sharp knife from her backpack, forged by her father, a blade that had served generations. It was not an instrument of violence, but of sustenance, of connection to the cycle of life. With firm hands but full of reverence, Yelena began the task. The Kolima approached, sensing the seriousness of the moment. Koda sat beside Yelena, watching with impressive calm, as if he understood the gravity of the act. The other dogs nestled close, forming a circle of support and silence. The task was arduous. The buffalo's hide was incredibly thick, and each cut required strength and precision. Yelena worked tirelessly, her muscles burning, but the image of the village's hungry faces, especially Anya's, was a balm for her pain. She knew that every piece of meat was a promise, a renewed hope. She separated the choicest parts, those that would bring the most warmth and nutrition to the weakened bodies. The work was slow, meticulous, and the cold of the cave, though milder, still bit at her exposed hands. She paused occasionally to warm her hands with her breath, and Koda, noticing, nudged his muzzle against her gloves, offering silent warmth. After what seemed like endless hours, a considerable pile of meat was laid out on an animal hide she had brought. It was a quantity that seemed impossible to carry, but the satisfaction of seeing it was immense. The buffalo, though injured, remained immobilized, its breathing now softer, as if the gift had been accepted. Yelena knew she had to be quick. Other buffalo might return, or the ice could give way. She needed to transport the meat to the sled. With the help of the Kolima, who, with their strength and intelligence, pulled the hides laden with meat, Yelena began to drag the pieces out of the cave, back to where the sled and the other dogs waited. With each trip, the weight of the meat was a tangible reminder of her victory. The icy air of Yakutia, which once seemed an enemy, was now an ally, helping to preserve the meat. When the last piece was loaded and the sled was overflowing, Yelena felt a profound weariness, but also an indescribable joy. She looked back at the cave, at the fallen buffalo, and made a final bow. "May its strength guide us," she murmured. The resolution of the main conflict was there, visible, palpable. The village would be saved, not by violent death, but by wisdom and respect for life. The journey back, the 300 kilometers of desolation, promised to be as challenging as the outward trip. But now the sled was not empty. It was laden with hope, with the promise of life, with the future of her people. The journey home had begun, a triumphant return, laden with a miracle of ice and courage. Koda and the Kolima, sensing the new purpose, pulled the sled with renewed energy. The icy wind whipped her face, but she didn't feel the cold. She felt the flame of hope, the strength of YAKUT resilience pulsing in her chest. The village waited, and she was returning, bringing not just meat, but proof that the human spirit, when guided by love and wisdom, can defy the impossible and bring light even in the deepest darkness. The journey home had begun, a triumphant return, laden with a miracle of ice and courage. The journey home had begun, a triumphant return, laden with a miracle of ice and courage. The Kolima, with Koda in the lead, pulled the heavy sled with determination. The wind whipped Yelena's face, but the cold seemed to have lost its bite, the flame of hope burning brightly in her chest. The 300 kilometers back were a challenge, but each step of the dogs and the creak of the wood reminded her of the life she carried. The icy landscapes, once desolate, now tinged with promise, seemed less threatening. Yelena, exhausted but with an unwavering spirit, alternated between guiding and walking, feeling the weight of the meat like an embrace. She thought of the faces awaiting her, of the joy that Anya, with her eyes full of faith, would be the first to show, while Yelena battled the white vastness back in the village. Despair deepened. The days dragged on, cold and empty. Food reserves were low, smoke from the chimneys grew scarce. Children, once full of energy, played in silence, their bodies bent by hunger. Anya, at the window of her yurt, watched the snow, her heart heavy. Her grandmother's words about hope never dying seemed distant. The elders gathered, their voices low, faces marked by worry, fearing the worst, but refusing to give up their faith in Yelena. It was then that Koda, the pack leader, raised his head. A distant howl, almost inaudible, tore through the icy air. The village dogs, previously prostrate, pricked up their ears, responding with weak barks. Full of new energy, Anya, sensing something, ran outside, her eyes sweeping the horizon. Far away, where the grey sky met the white plain, a small, dark speck appeared. It grew, slowly, until the unmistakable silhouette of a sled and a dog team became visible. It was Yelena. A cry of pure joy erupted from Anya's throat, echoing through the village. "Grandma! Grandma is coming back!" The villagers, previously motionless, rushed out of their yurts, disbelieving eyes fixed on the sight. There she was, small and bent with fatigue, but upright in her purpose, pulling a sled that looked like a mountain of hope. When the sled stopped in the central square, silence fell over the crowd, broken only by muffled sobs of relief. Yelena dismounted, her knees trembling, but her eyes shining. Anya ran to her, hugging her legs tightly, tears wetting the worn furs. Yelena, with a tired smile, pointed to the sled. "I brought food, my children. I brought life." The villagers approached, eyes wide at the sight of the abundant meat, piled high and frozen. It wasn't just meat, it was the promise of warmth, strength, and a tomorrow. That night, the fire crackled louder. The smell of cooked meat, long forgotten, filled the village. The children ate until their hunger was satisfied, their faces lit by smiles previously impossible. The elders, with tears in their eyes, ate in silence, their wrinkled hands holding the pieces like treasures. Yelena, sitting by the fire, watched her village reborn. She was no longer just an elderly widow. She was the guardian of life, the living symbol of YAKUT resilience. Her journey proved that true strength resided not in brutality, but in cunning, patience, and unconditional love for her people. Yelena's village, once on the brink of the abyss, found its way back to the light, guided by the courage of a woman who defied the impossible. Yelena's story, a reminder that hope flourishes even in the icy heart of Yakutia, driven by the strength of the human spirit, would be told for generations. Yelena's story, a reminder that hope flourishes even in the icy heart of Yakutia, driven by the strength of the human spirit, would be told for generations, and so it was. In the days that followed her triumphant return, Yelena's village, once plunged into the darkness of despair, began to awaken to a new dawn. The smell of cooked meat hung in the air, no longer a distant memory, but a comforting reality that warmed bodies and souls. The campfires, once timid, crackled with renewed vigor, casting dancing shadows on the yurt walls, while laughter and lively conversations replaced the oppressive silence. Life, in its purest essence, pulsed again with full and unwavering strength. The children, with rosy cheeks and bright eyes, returned to running and playing in the snow, their long-lost energy returning with each hearty meal. Anya, in particular, clung to her grandmother, her small fingers often intertwined with Yelena's, as if fearing she might disappear again. The elder, though exhausted, found solace and renewal in her granddaughter's joy and the rebirth of her community. She observed every face, every smile, and felt the reward of her journey more deeply than any physical fatigue. The elders, who once carried the weight of the world on their hunched shoulders, now sat around the campfires, their voices stronger, their stories more vibrant. They spoke of Yelena's courage, not with distant admiration, but with a reverence that recognized the strength residing within each of them, dormant, but now awakened. The hunt was not just about food. It was about the rediscovery of the YAKUT essence itself, the ability to persist, to innovate, to unite against the cruelest adversities. Yelena, for her part, remained the same humble woman, but her gaze carried an even greater depth. She divided the meat with fairness and wisdom, ensuring that each family received enough to recover. The pieces of buffalo, carefully preserved in the ice, represented not just food, but a treasure of hope that would last for many months, seeing them through the rest of winter and preparing them for spring. Human connection in the village deepened. Families helped each other, sharing not just food, but the work of repairing yurts, gathering firewood and caring for the dogs. Koda and the Kolima, the true silent heroes of the journey, were treated with affection and respect, receiving extra portions of meat and everyone's fondness. They were living proof of the loyalty and partnership that made life possible in those inhospitable lands. Yelena often sat at night, watching the stars that twinkled in Yakutia's icy sky, and thought of the buffalo. She felt a deep gratitude for the giant's sacrifice, a gift that had cost one life to save the lives of many. That act, guided not by violence but by necessity and cunning, had redefined the village's relationship with nature. They learned that strength was not just brute force, but also intelligence and respect for the cycle of life. Yelena's village not only survived, it flourished. The story of the elder who defied the impossible became a pillar of their identity, a tale of resilience that would be passed down by word of mouth from generation to generation. It was a constant reminder that even in the depths of the harshest winter, the flame of hope, courage, and unconditional love for family and community would never be extinguished. The true strength of Yakutia resided not just in its ability to endure the cold, but in its indomitable spirit, capable of transforming despair into triumph. And Yelena, the elderly widow with an indomitable spirit, was the living embodiment of that eternal truth.